Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I want to say thank you all for coming, taking this time out of your evening to come to this meeting. My name is Kyle Ross. I'm the MGEU president, and we'll begin our meeting with the land acknowledgement. The MGEU operates throughout Manitoba and is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Anishinawak, Innuwak, Nehatuak, Dakota, Dene, and Métis people. Our primary office is located on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Red River Métis. Our work extends throughout Treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10. We acknowledge that Winnipeg's water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. We respect the treaties made on these territories. We dedicate ourselves to move forward with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration to make Manitoba an inclusive and accessible place for everyone who lives here. Before we get started, first I'm going to introduce your bargaining committee. Excuse me, we have Michelle Skibinski representing the admin component. We have Chiffon McLeod from Clerical, Jeff Reddy from Corrections, Deb Jamerson from Legal, Brian Wilson from Physical Sciences, Kira Shattuck from Social Sciences, Eldon Bergson from the Trades, Scott Cloney, our first Vice President, and Colin Ghostkeeper, our staff negotiator. As you're probably aware, here at the MGU, our summer's been pretty busy. I've been sprouting lots of gray hairs and lost a lot of sleep, but it's been a real important summer to try and catch up and keep up. We started this program, Catch Up and Keep, back in February. Since then, we've seen 2% offers for wages at all our bargaining tables, colleges, liquor, MPI, to name a few. And now the civil service members have been offered that same 2% wage increase in each year of a 4-year collective agreement. 2%, when last year alone, the cost of living rose by 7.9%. 2%, when the Premier herself and other MLAs are receiving well over 3% for the next 3 years, 23, 24, and 25. This is totally disrespectful. In their offer, they've included a signing bonus, which is always nice, and a few touch-ups to health benefits. But at the end of the day, that doesn't help pay the bills going forward. Like with liquor and lotteries and MPI, the employer is already spinning things, claiming that their offer is 16.2% over 4 years. But of course, they count the one-time bonus, benefit enhancement, and other non-wage items. This is not true. That's why your bargaining committee is recommending you reject this offer and provide them with a strike mandate. And a strike mandate doesn't necessarily mean you'll go on strike. This summer, hundreds of MGU members, including those with University of St. Boniface and St. Amant Community Program, delivered strong strike mandates. This was enough to give their bargaining committee the leverage they needed to get back to the table and reach a fair deal. But it's possible that strike action may be necessary. Our liquor workers went out and proved that the government's 2% wage mandate is, in fact, negotiable. Our fellow members at MPI continue to walk the line, determined to achieve what we all deserve, fairness. With a group this size of civil service, you have all kinds of options when it comes to disrupting services. Refusing overtime, targeted work stoppages, rotating pickets. After the summer, we're getting pretty good at this. The key is to remain strategic and flexible. But let's get down to the business at hand. Tonight, you're going to get a bargaining update from your lead negotiator, Colin Ghostkeeper. Then you'll hear from Susan Dawes, our lawyer at Myers. She'll talk about essential services and the different types of strike action. Then we'll hear from Jean-Guy Bourgeois, Director of Internal Operations at MGEU. Jean-Guy will talk about the strike pay. Following the presentations of our panelists, we'll open it up to you for questions. We know with so many of you at this meeting, we're going to have a lot of questions. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Should at any time you need technical support, we'll ask that you direct those questions to Data on the Spot. The company has taken care of making sure this meeting runs smoothly tonight. And after that, now I'll pass it over to Colin to take us through the bargaining update.
Thank you, Kyle. So since negotiations began March 29th, our intent has been to work collaboratively with this employer to address the many priorities received from our members across the province. The employer made it known that they were not prepared to bargain once the provincial election was called, September 5th, and we knew we only had a finite amount of time to bargain with this employer. Your bargaining committee has been at the table almost every week since the beginning of April with the intent of reaching a fair settlement offer that would help our members catch up and keep up with the rising cost of living and the increasing inflationary pressures. We've met with the employer on 20 occasions since March, and we've spent most of April to the end of June discussing non-monetary proposals. On June 26, the employer tabled their first monetary offer, which was consistent with other Crown and public service bargaining tables seen previously, increases of 1.75% and 1.5% over a 4-year agreement. On July 6, your bargaining committee tabled a monetary offer on general wages to the employer consistent with the same formula used for the Premier, Cabinet, and MLAs. This formula would provide general wage increases equal to the 5-year moving average of Manitoba CPI increases based on the Manitoba Bureau of Statistics. We also tabled a one-time increase of 1.55% to all classifications and pay bands. This with a $1,400 signing bonus for full-time and $700 for part-time. The province was adamant that they would not agree to any fairness formula that would take cost of living into consideration. We continued to address the remaining monetary and non-monetary proposals throughout July and August, and the employer would continue to ignore our priorities through our ongoing discussions, and in some cases had reduced their initial offer to bully our committee into withdrawing many of our priorities. We were committed to hearing the concerns from management and providing counter proposals that still addressed our members' needs and the employer's concerns, only to be told they simply were not prepared to make any headway. We point blank asked the employer out of frustration what their plan was to address the recruitment and retention issues facing the civil service, and they refused to provide an answer or even at a minimum acknowledge that there was a problem. On August 22nd, the committee received a settlement offer that included the 2% in each year of a 4-year contract, but the employer withdrew several items that we believe we were making progress on that would have benefited our members. The employer cited that the union was not moving enough to withdraw our priorities to show what a total compensation package would look like based on the employer's mandate. At this point, the committee's frustration had reached its limits, and we decided as a committee that the province was not committed to reaching a fair offer, and we believed we were only bargaining against ourselves. The committee as a whole believed we had reached an impasse and advised the employer that we were taking this out for our members to reject and to authorize the bargaining committee to take strike action. We did not believe that the province was showing our members the respect they deserve, or were they serious about addressing our needs to catch up and keep up. We communicated this impasse to the membership and posted their offer online. Knowing that the employer would not bargain once the election was called, we did not feel that if we continued at this point, would the employer present an offer that would come close to what our members would view as fair. That afternoon and late in the evening, we received scathing emails from the employer stating how dare we walk away without being final offered, as they clearly were not prepared for our response communicating an impasse. They implored us to return to the table so they could enhance their offer. Clearly, they were embarrassed by what was presented to the membership. We decided as a committee to return to the table to allow the employer one last opportunity to demonstrate their willingness to address our concerns and our outstanding proposals. On August 31st, the province tabled the offer we are reviewing today. Clearly, their intent was to enhance the offer in a way that would characterize to members and to the public in a misleading way that would suggest that we were receiving a compensation package on wages equal to 16.2%. I assure you, if this committee received a monetary offer with general increases of 16%, we would have been happy to come to the membership with a recommendation to accept. But what they have done and continue to believe is that the membership and the public are not smart enough to see right through their lies. 2 hours after we had met with the employer, they released a communication to our members and the public announcing their so-called generous offer of 16.2%. Now, this offer includes 2% over 4 years, with the ability to go to voluntary interest arbitration. Now, arbitration would only be limited to the wage increases of 2%. The union would not be able to raise any other concerns through this process based on the current offer. Now, throughout these negotiations, we've maintained our position that arbitration should be included in the collective agreement if the parties were to reach an impasse. The proposal was the direct result of the changes made through the newly created Public Services Act that removed access to arbitration if the parties reached an impasse. Now, the government made these changes after they failed to impose their legislation, effectively freezing public sector wages with Bill 28. We also had to file a lawsuit against the province to have them comply with going to arbitration in the last round. Now, in certain cases, arbitration can be a benefit, but it doesn't always provide the best outcome. And it's essentially the roll of the dice when it comes to the process of replicating what the parties should be able to reach through an agreed to settlement. We do not believe that arbitration will achieve the needed increases to wages that will help address how far behind we are and help us keep up going forward. It is certain that these gains need to be made at the bargaining table. Now, the process of arbitration could take longer than a year to complete, and arbitration denies our members the ability to have their voices heard. It takes away our members' right to vote on the potential settlement. Now, the next piece the employer tabled was a one-time lump sum signing bonus of $1,800 for full-time and $900 for part-time. It is true that it would be a percentage equivalent to about 2.7 on a salary of 67,000. However, this money would not be compounded on wages like a general wage increase. Signing bonuses are not pensionable. And as part of the enhanced offer, they have also increased the amount allocated to special wage adjustments. This from 0.75% of payroll to 2.5%. This again was used to inflate the overall numbers of their offer. Now, as many will know from past rounds, this money is only allocated to certain classifications, not all civil servants. The funding commitment would see money allocated equally over the next 4 years. There is no indication what classifications will receive these funds or what amount. Now, there was or has been some modest gains made with the employer paid health benefit maximums, but we continue to be behind other collective agreements in different sectors across the province. Something new this round was the offer that the 2 sick days as wellness days, and this was tabled by your employer. It wasn't something that we asked for. This time essentially would be provided as much like vacation days, but it would come out of their sick bank. They are not carried over if unused and do not accumulate. Members must have a minimum of 12 sick days in their bank to access these days. The process to take these days, as we are advised by the province, would be like vacation time, and approval from management must be given prior to taking the time. And we are still concerned that no guarantees have been made that this time will not be used against our members when it comes to sick time usage for attendance management. Now, the offer also contains increases to weekend premiums, remoteness allowance, and northern premiums in line with the general wage increase. Although we received a modest increase through arbitration last round to meal allowances, the employer did not increase these allowances in their settlement offer. We still feel the amounts allocated currently do not come close to compensating our members as the cost have increased drastically. For many years, we've been trying to incorporate language providing legal indemnification against criminal and civil actions taken against our members where they have acted in good faith of their duties. We believe we are making progress on this, but reached an impasse when the two parties could not agree on legal counsel. Now, this would be in an instance where the evidence that a member provides is contrary to the position government may take in court. In this instance, we believe that our members should have the right to obtain their own legal counsel, where the employer would still be responsible for reasonable legal fees and disbursement of funds. What they tabled back to us would only provide cost recovery using the Legal Aid Manitoba Tariff Fee Guide. Our legal counsel has advised us that members in these instances would never be able to hire a lawyer at those rates. The only lawyer who may agree to represent our member would barely be out of law school. Now, this amounts to 2 tiers of justice if the member and the employer are unable to agree on using their approved employer legal counsel. Now, when we talk about classification modernization, and I can't stress enough how scary this is and should be very concerning to our members. Now, the employer has indicated that they intend to proceed with their project to overhaul the classification system within the civil service. This project may have far-reaching implications for salaries, hours of work, overtime, and other terms contained in the component subagreements. Although the union proposed a pilot project with protections for salaries and other terms, this employer refused to agree. So first and foremost, this round of negotiation was about wages. It was about catching up and keeping up. We stated that wage increases in the public service have been modest and have not kept up with the rising cost of living and the inflationary pressures. Our members have lost ground, and we've said it's vital this be addressed and that this be addressed now. Based on the current offer presented by the employer August 31st, our members will continue to fall behind. It was our collective hope that this round of bargaining was also about restoring the viability and integrity of the public service. Through these negotiations, this employer has not demonstrated a willingness to be competitive with many other employers in this sector or with other provincial governments across Canada. Over the past several years, this employer has starved the public service. Our members have been doing the work of 2, 3, or more. Vacancies have been left unfilled, and in many cases, the employer is not able to recruit and fill essential positions needed to provide services to Manitobans. This employer is no longer an employer of choice, no longer a competitive employer. Workers are not applying, and those on staff are fleeing the service because of the overwhelming demands and better opportunities elsewhere. The civil service has become the training ground for new employees entering the labor market, only to leave the service for better opportunities elsewhere, as other levels of government and employers in the private sector are now more competitive than the civil service. We've seen cuts and privatization of critical services, resulting in greater costs to the government and the public. Well, this package is supposed to be innovative and flexible and address our members' needs. The employer has clearly missed that mark. Our members are frustrated by the lack of respect they have received from this employer. If the employer had our members' interests at heart, they would have presented something that genuinely helps our members with the rising costs of inflation. Now, while this government is mandating insufficient wage increases for unionized public workers, the Premier and her cabinet are taking more for themselves. Last month, the Premier released a campaign video suggesting that our union is playing politics. If this Premier believes that fairness is giving its workers less while she, her cabinet, and MLAs get more, then that is where we draw the line. When our public service is thriving, so is Manitoba's economy. Our members spend their money in their home province, which benefits all Manitobans. This government has contracted out jobs, services to out-of-province contracts, sending Manitobans money elsewhere in Canada and North America. It was the committee's hope to take back an offer that would allow our members to catch up and keep up. In the absence of that commitment, we are left here making the tough choice to walk away with the employer's current settlement package and go to our members requesting they reject the current offer and authorize their bargaining committee to take strike action. Now, providing your committee with the mandate to take strike action does not immediately mean that we will be going out on strike. This will provide your committee with the much needed support from our members to get back to the bargaining table and negotiate a fair deal. The province needs to know we have the full support of the membership. So we ask for your support, and together we will reach a fair deal for all civil servants.
Thank you, Colin. Now I'd like to call on Susan Dawes to talk about essential services and the different types of strike action.
All right, thanks very much, and very glad to be here tonight to speak to these issues. So you've been asked by Colin and the bargaining committee to reject the employer's offer and vote instead to provide a strike mandate. And as Colin and Kyle have both said, a strike mandate doesn't mean that the union has to call for strike action, but there is a legal requirement in the Labor Relations Act that a strike vote must be conducted before strike action can be taken. So a vote in favor doesn't mean there has to be a strike, but it allows for that possibility. And quite often, a strike vote is taken simply to increase leverage at the bargaining table, in that the employer knows that the bargaining committee is serious, that it won't accept what's on offer. And in many cases, that alone can break the deadlock at the bargaining table. But the union's bargaining committee would decide whether strike action is actually required, and if so, how would that occur? And so both parties, pursuant to the Labor Relations Act, are under an ongoing duty to bargain with a view to reaching a collective agreement. And so, first order of business is to get back to the bargaining table after a strike vote is taken. But if things break down and it becomes necessary in the judgment of the committee, strike action is a possibility. So, what is a strike? And I guess many people think of an all-out walkout, and they think of shutting down the plant, so to speak, and all the workers walking out with their lunch boxes. That's the stuff of decades ago, and it's now well recognized, and in fact recognized in our Labor Relations Act, that a strike, the definition of strike, is very, very broad. So it can include everything from a cessation of work, a refusal to work, a refusal to continue to work, a refusal to continue to work your shift cycle that you normally work, any slowdown, any activity designed to restrict output. And it's got to be done by employees in combination. And it's got to be done for the purpose of compelling their employer to agree to a new collective agreement. So the definition is very, very broad and really can be lots of things, or it can be very minor. So a strike can be targeted to particular areas within the civil service. In this case, it could be targeted to particular work in particular areas. It could be rotating, could be here one day, there the next, et cetera, et cetera. Or there could be a full walkout. And in a bargaining unit as big as the civil service, there are literally a myriad of options for your bargaining committee to consider in deciding what is the best approach in the circumstance. And that best approach will depend on the timing of the strike, but it'll depend on all kinds of other factors. And so many unions are finding that rotating or targeted strikes are much more effective than an all out walkout. And this is because they're very unpredictable for the employer. The employer will have great difficulty responding. And that was certainly the case in the recent MBLL strike, where MGEU was advising the employer at every day, late in the day, what the plan for the next day would be, who would be on strike that next day. And this really wreaked havoc on the ability of the corporation to assign managers or others, replacement workers, as they're called in our legislation, to do the work. And so it's important to think about strikes as a form of economic warfare. That's how they're discussed in the case law from labor boards and from courts. Your bargaining committee will need to think strategically what form of strike action would have the most impact. And the goal, of course, is to convince the employer to come back to the table and make a fair and reasonable proposal that the bargaining committee can recommend for you to ratify. And so the bargaining committee needs to balance the need to gain and indeed to keep public support for strike action with the need to create maximum impact to increase that leverage. And so there may be areas within the civil service, which is extraordinarily broad and diverse. There may be areas where it makes no political sense to take certain employees out. And, you know, I think of things like child welfare or EIA, those kind of departments. And maybe there's no leverage to be gained at the table. So maybe the decision of the committee would be to focus on other areas. So there might be other areas that would create real serious economic issues for government. And some examples there might be abattoirs, might be tax auditors. There's any number of examples. And so you can reasonably expect that the bargaining committee will be focusing on choosing areas that will affect members of the public who can bring significant pressure on the government, phoning the minister's office, phoning the premier's office, telling them to get to the bargaining table with a fair proposal because they don't want to be affected by this strike. So now there is an important sort of baseline in terms of what strike action can be taken in the public service, and that brings me to the discussion of essential services. So there's legislation in Manitoba that requires essential services to be provided by government employees in the event of a work stoppage, a strike, or a lockout. And Manitoba's legislation, as it applies to civil servants, is outdated. And my view is that it's unconstitutional. And I won't get into all the reasons why that is. We'll focus tonight on the practicalities of that. But because we took that view, the first task for MGEU was to bargain what we've called a negotiating protocol for an essential services agreement that would be constitutional. And so that agreement was completed in the early spring, and it was signed by the province and MGEU. And the protocol sets out a definition of essential services that is consistent with what the Supreme Court of Canada has said are essential services. And so, according to the Supreme Court of Canada, essential services means services that are necessary to enable the employer to prevent one of three things. So, the first one is preventing danger to the life, personal safety, or health of the whole or part of the population. The second is preventing serious environmental damage. And the third is preventing disruption to the maintenance and administration of the rule of law. So in other words, the last one sort of deals with the courts have to keep operating. So, what is an essential service during a strike or lockout is not the same. It's not necessarily the same as who had to work throughout the recent pandemic. And so that's one important takeaway. What is essential in this context of a strike really has to meet that definition, one of those three prongs of that definition I just went through. So it's not necessarily about who worked during COVID, and it's not a judgment about whether your work's important enough or important. Civil servants do incredibly important work. It may not meet that very narrow definition. So we need to think about it in these terms. The right to strike is a constitutional right, and it's part and parcel of the freedom of association under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the right to strike is part of the process of collective bargaining. And if we're limiting that right, it better be for serious and justifiable reasons. So another takeaway is that MGU has been working very, very hard, and I've been assisting in that effort to ensure that the right of its members to engage in strike action is limited as little as possible. And so we've been negotiating an essential services agreement, and there is very significant momentum in that process right now. We have reached agreement in a number of areas. There are others that remain, and discussions are ongoing. And it's a real focus right now to get this done as quickly as possible because it needs to be done in order for strike action to be taken. So we're not in a position tonight to address the specifics of the areas affected until we have final agreement. Although you can think about whether your job might be necessary to enable the employer to prevent one of those things: danger to life, safety, health, environmental damage, disruption to the maintenance and administration of the rule of law. You can think about that. And what I can do today is speak about our current understanding of the practical implications for those who may be considered to be essential services employees. So I'll talk about that in general terms. What'll happen? Once there is an essential services agreement in place, the employer will be notifying all employees whose jobs have been identified as essential in whole or in part. And so each employee would get a letter from the employer setting out a list of which of their work functions must continue to be provided in the event of a strike. So for some employees, that could be the whole of their job. For others, it could be as little as 15 to 20% of their regular job, or it could be anywhere in between. So sometimes 80, anywhere in there. And if only part of your job's identified as essential, the employer will not be asking you to do any non-essential duties. And in fact, that would be a violation of the Essential Services Agreement if you were asked to do non-essential duties. And we would want you to get on the phone right away to the resource center at MGU to let them know. And there'll be a dispute resolution mechanism that'll allow us to very, very quickly, like within a day or two, to get to arbitration to have those kind of disputes resolved if they arise. So if only part of an employee's job is identified as essential, as I said, you're not going to be doing the non-essential duties. So you may have to go in and do part of your job. In some cases, you might be the only person who does that job. You're one of one person who does those tasks. And so during a strike, you would need to continue to do those tasks. And it might be on a full-time basis, it might be on a part-time basis. It could also be on an on-call basis. And we've been reviewing a number of situations where a number of members respond to emergent situations, floods, fires, any number of circumstances. And those are the types of people who may be on call in the event that something arises. And those somethings will be defined in the agreement. Another possibility is that there might be a larger number of people who perform the duties normally who then are required during a strike. So for example, if there's 20 employees in the same role and we've identified that 5 are required to work in order to provide essential services, there would be a schedule set in advance so that you will know when during a strike you will have to work and when you're free to engage in strike action. So set in advance. Okay, week 1, it's this 5 people. Week 2, it's these 5 people, etc. And so if your work area is targeted by the bargaining committee for strike action in week 2 and you're on the list to work in week 2, you'd be obliged to work. But if it's targeted in week 1 and you're not on the list to work that week, you'd be free to participate in strike action. So I want to emphasize that all of this will be explained in detail. It sounds overwhelming now, I'm sure, but we'll ensure that everybody has a very good understanding of the situation before any strike action is taken. Those who are required to work during the strike, if there is one, would get paid in accordance with the terms and conditions of the previous collective agreement, even though that collective agreement terminates when the strike commences. That's part of the essential services agreement. And we're also discussing provisions for on-call or standby pay that would apply to those who would be expected to be on call during regular working hours, because that's not something that normally arises. So I will summarize some key points from what I've said. A strike vote is the first step in sending a strong message to this employer, the government, that its proposal is not acceptable and that you are prepared to back the union by striking if that is necessary in order to get a fair deal. As I said, just because the union gets a strike mandate doesn't mean there will be a strike, but it provides that authorization if the bargaining committee decides that it's necessary down the road. If there's a strike, there are a multitude of options for your committee to consider. So even if there is a strike, not all areas will necessarily be on strike. If your work area is on strike at a given time, you may be required to work for all or a portion of the strike in order to provide these narrowly defined essential services that'll be defined and set out in a letter to you. If there is a targeted or rotating strike and your area is not the part that's targeted at a given time, you would continue to work as usual. So hopefully that's helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have as best I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Next, we'll pass it over to Jean-Guy Bourgeois. He's going to take us through strike pay, and then we'll get the questions. So, Jean-Guy.
Thanks, Kyle. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what strike pay looks should we get into the unfortunate situation of having to go on strike. The good news is that your board of directors recommended a number of changes to significantly improve strike pay, and those were passed at a special convention earlier this year. So the amount of strike pay has gone up quite a bit, and the union has much more flexibility to provide strike pay to members in a variety of situations that fall short of a full strike. So in terms of the details, I'm going to start by talking about what we call regular strike pay. So regular strike pay is the type of strike pay that we pay when a bargaining unit decides to do a full walkout, similar to what's happening at MPI right now. A full walkout, so if the civil service to do a full walkout, that would obviously be everybody other than essential services workers under the agreement. And the strike pay in that situation would be 70%, 70% of your regular gross pay up to a cap of $500 per week. So that's 70% of your gross pay up to a cap of $500 per week. In order to qualify for strike pay, you need to perform a minimum of 4 hours of picket duty per day. And over a 5-day week, that's 20 hours of picket duty. And if you do the full 20 hours, then you get the full strike pay. If you do 1 day of picket duty, then you get 1/5 of a week's strike pay. There is also a minimum of $300 per week for strike pay, so you'll never get less than $300. When you hear those numbers, they may sound smaller than you'd like. I just want to emphasize that strike pay is non-taxable. You don't pay a penny of tax on strike pay. So if you want to compare the amount of strike pay that you would receive to your current earnings, you should compare it to your after-tax, after deductions net pay. The other thing that's important to point out is that you pay no union dues while you are on strike and in receipt of strike pay. So if your work is on strike and you are picketing, you don't pay any union dues on your strike pay, but you remain a member in good standing nonetheless. On that point about strike pay being tax-free, that is why strike pay is set at 70% of your regular earnings, because most working people pay an effective tax rate of approximately 30%. So it's meant to get you closer to your normal take-home pay, except for the cap. So that's what happens in a regular strike. However, we have also situations where we do what's called a targeted strike. You saw some of that at the land title office over the past couple of months. A targeted strike is where a portion of you go on strike while everybody else continues to go to work and receive their regular pay. And in those situations, we provide what's called enhanced strike pay, which means you get 70% of your regular pay, period. There is no cap of $500 per week. So that gets you pretty close. It should approximate what your regular take-home pay is after taxes and deductions. And the reason we provide enhanced strike pay in those situations is twofold. One, it's easier to afford it because fewer people are on strike and in receipt of strike pay. And also to make it fair, because some people are going to work and getting their regular pay, and a minority are doing the burden, carrying the burden of the strike. A third situation is what we call rotating strikes. That's where all members in the bargaining unit who are not deemed essential share equally in the picket duty and in the strike duty. So just for example, it could be a situation where everybody is on strike for 1 day a week and they rotate through. So 20% of you would be on Monday, 20% on Tuesday, 20% on Wednesday, and so on. In those situations, you would receive regular strike pay, that's 70% of regular earnings up to the $500 cap for that 1 day of picket duty. So that would be 20% of a week's strike pay. And then when you go to work on the other 4 days, you'd get your regular pay. So those are the 3 categories of strike pay. There are some other, though, important things to emphasize. If you are deemed essential, that is, you continue to work during a strike while other members of your bargaining unit carry the burden of the strike, you're continuing to earn your regular pay. And because of that, our Constitution requires that members who continue to work under an essential services agreement during a strike pay an additional dues rate. The reason for the additional dues rate is it's partly a contribution to the cost of the strike, because of course, if you're working on essential services, you're going to benefit from whatever is won through the strike. It's also makes sure that everybody has a little bit of skin in the game, so everybody has a bit of an incentive to ultimately get to a resolution. And it also just gets everybody to share a little more equitably in the burden of the strike. And any revenue generated by that additional dues rate is automatically deposited into the defense fund. That's required by our Constitution. It basically goes into the same fund that funds strike pay. You're probably asking yourself, how much is the extra dues rate for people deemed essential? And the answer is that has yet to be determined. Under the old rules before 2023, it was 30% of your regular pay. The board of directors and the special convention that we held earlier this year, they felt that 30% was much too high. So what they've done is they've given the board of directors the power to set the extra dues rate anywhere between 0 and 30%. And that calculation of that depends on what portion of you are deemed essential. We don't have the essential services agreement concluded yet, so the board's not able to make that determination yet. As soon as it's concluded, the board will convene the board and they can make that decision. But I can assure you that the discussions we've had with the board are that they have no intention of levying an essential services additional dues rate anywhere close to 30%. That's why the rule was changed, and the desire is to keep it significantly lower. There is also a special rule that applies to any members who choose to cross the picket line and work contrary to the strike plan. If anybody chooses to do that, they are automatically, under our Constitution, required to pay an additional dues rate of 30%. And the reason for that is crossing a picket line and and betraying your coworkers causes the strike to be longer. And it also undermines the whole point of the strike. And at the same time, the people who do that, eventually they're going to benefit from whatever is gained through the strike. So it's a long-standing provision in the MGEU Constitution that requires anybody who crosses the picket line and is going to work, not because of an essential service agreement, but just because they're working contrary to the strike plan, to pay an extra dues rate of 30%. Just want to mention the way we pay strike pay is we have an arrangement with a local payroll firm, Payworks. What that does is that members who want to receive strike pay, they provide their banking information to Payworks. They don't give it to us. We don't have to touch it. Payworks has a secure system for keeping the confidentiality of that. And then we just tell Payworks how much to pay you. It works very well. It's been working super well for the liquor strike and the MPI strike and the land title strike. And I can assure you it's going very well. But I just want to make sure people understand that if you want to get strike pay, and we do end up in a strike situation, then we need to have your email address, because we give it to Payworks, they email you, you provide your banking information to them directly using their secure system. So if you want to get strike pay, we're going to need to have your current personal email address. It also happens to be a good way to get bargaining updates. So please go to our website and update your email contact info, or call our resource center and update it with them. Final point I want to make about strike pay is it's not pensionable. So if you're receiving strike pay, you're not making pension contributions on that, and you're not contributing to your pension. But luckily, CSSB does have provisions that allow you to buy back that pension time after a strike is over. And in fact, we have that happening right now with liquor workers. They're in the same pension plan you are, and they're currently learning about how to make those arrangements to buy back that time. So that's really all I have to say about strike pay. I'm sure there are some questions, and I'll be happy to answer them when we get to that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Guy. And I guess now we'll get to your questions. So our first question is, when are we going on strike? And that's a really good question. And the true question is, once you give us a strike mandate, the true answer is we'll try to work with the employer and bargain a deal. We want to avoid a strike as best we can. No one wants to go on strike. They're difficult. They're hard on our members. They're hard on everyone. So our goal is to avoid a strike. So when you give us a strike mandate on October 6th, your bargaining committee is going to go back to the table as soon as they can and try to bargain a fair deal for you guys to make sure we don't. But if worst case scenario where we can't get a deal at that table, we're likely to be on strike sometime, I'd say late October. It's hard to say. It's really, we're just spitballing, but that it would probably be late October, early November. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Let's hope we can get a fair deal at the table. So next question is, when do we vote? The voting will open on September 22nd at 2 p.m. and it'll be open till October 6th at noon. So you should get emailed credentials via your email or mail. So if you don't get one, I'd say by end of day on, I guess, Friday's the 22nd, please reach out to the resource center and we'll hopefully figure out why you haven't got your credentials, and we'll send some out to you. So if you're watching this and you don't get credentials, please reach out. We'll gladly get you some credentials. So next question what are the next steps? What happens if a new government comes in? How does that affect things at the bargaining table? If a new government comes in, it may change things at the bargaining table, but it doesn't change what we want to do. We're trying to get a fair deal for your members, and the deal that's in front of you right now is not good enough. And that doesn't change if the government changes on October 3rd. That's still what we have in front of us, and it doesn't mean that if a new government comes in, will treat us any fairer. We hope they will, but we don't know they will. So giving us a strong strike mandate leading up into that next round will definitely ensure you guys get a better deal. So what happens to the dues rate in a targeted strike? Jean-Guy?
In a targeted strike, so the people who are participating in the targeted strike action, they don't pay any dues at all because they're in receipt of strike pay. They maintain their membership in good standing without paying any dues, and their strike pay is enhanced to approximate the normal take-home pay. For people who continue to work while those others are doing the targeted strike, they just pay the regular dues rate of 1.25%.
Thank you, Jean-Guy. Next question is, why wouldn't we be interested in arbitration? Colin?
Well, I think, what the employer is presenting is that they're only interested in going to arbitration on the 2% offer on general wages. And, we do not believe that an arbitrator is going to help. What our true goal is to catch up and keep up. And we don't believe that an arbitrator is going to provide us those general wage increases through an arbitration process specific to wages. We believe that those gains have to be made at the negotiation table with the employer.
Thanks, Colin. I have another one for you. If I have scheduled vacation later this fall, what happens if we go on strike?
Well, it really depends on the type of strike that takes place. As as Susan had said, and as Jean-Guy had said, I mean, there's obviously different ways or different types of strike. But if you are in an area that it has struck work and you have scheduled vacation, you are not going to lose that time. That time, potentially, if it is canceled by the employer, would be credited back to your vacation bank. But we have seen in other job actions with MBLL or in other areas where they have honored the vacation that was scheduled during that period of time and paid it out. But essentially, if you are planning a trip of some kind and you are unable to participate and do the picket duty, which would give you the strike pay, and you're having to head overseas, and you go overseas, but you're not going to get that strike pay. So, but there is instances where we want to discuss these things with the employer in advance of any potential job action to establish essentially some strike protocols, where we hope that the employer would honor any scheduled strike or any scheduled vacation period.
Thanks, Colin. If there is a strike mandate, how would this affect my clerical department? I work for inspections and technical services. Would this be carried out as a rotating departmental strike, an ongoing strike involving all provincial employees? Colin, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think, it really depends. It's up to the bargaining committee to establish what type of job action is to take place. And, obviously for reasons, as we've stated and Susan have stated, is that, when we communicate, the strategic action of taking, of job action, we don't want the employer to know this too far in advance. Obviously, as we've worked within respect to the MBLL and communicated, the day before potentially which stores would be closed down. We want to use, how and when we strike as strategically as possible. So to communicate exactly which pocket of employees at this point, I think that's something that has to be established with the bargaining committee. But again, trying to put the greatest amount of leverage to get the employer back to the bargaining table.
Thanks, Colin. What happens to my benefits if we go on strike? Do I still make pension contributions? It really depends on your employer. We saw with MBLL that their health benefits were stayed intact, and I believe we're seeing the same thing with MPI right now, that their health benefits stayed intact. The union will pay for your long-term LTD and a life insurance, like through work. The union, through our constitution, that's what we'll pay. And I need to take the question. And what was the second part?
Well, I could say that, in some cases where we establish with the employer in advance that there's an opportunity to ensure that the premiums can continue. With the civil service, we have benefits that are 100% paid by our members. And so if our members continue to make the contributions, they essentially will continue to have those benefits in place. But, when it comes to the employer paid benefits as well, we certainly want to be able to talk to the employer. We want to ensure that there is as least a disruption to our members' benefits as possible through any potential job action.
And then we forgot the pension part because they deleted the question before I was finished answering. But do I still make pension contributions? No. If you're on strike, you don't make pension contributions. But as Jean-Guy said, you'll have the opportunity to buy back that time should you choose to, depending on where you are in your work cycle or where you are from retirement. But that's the other thing, you don't make pension contributions. The next question is, will the union come out and do another vote before taking any job action? The answer is no. Once the committee has a strike vote, once you guys give them a strong strike mandate, they're going to try their best to avoid doing strike by going back to bargaining, but there is not a second vote. The next vote you'd likely receive is probably on an offer to whether you'd be going on strike or not. So the next question, can you explain target strike pay and essential workers during a targeted strike? Jean-Guy, want to take that one?
Sure. So just once again, a targeted strike is a situation where A minority of members are on strike full-time, and the rest of the bargaining unit continues to work as normal and receive normal pay. In those situations, the people who are on strike, doing the work of the strike for everyone else, they get what we call as an enhanced strike pay. That means they get 70% of their regular earnings with no cap. So that's meant to approximate your regular take-home pay after taxes and deductions, which most people, because most people's effective tax rate, working people anyway, is approximately 30%. That enhanced strike pay is meant to keep you largely whole, with the main difference being it's not pensionable. Everybody else just continue, and you don't pay any union dues. Those people who are on the targeted strike action, they don't pay any union dues, but they remain a member in good standing while they're doing the targeted strike. Everybody else just continues to do the work, receive their normal pay, and they pay the regular dues rate of 1.25%.
Thanks, Junkie. I'm planning on retiring soon. Is it better to wait or go now? Colin, please.
Well, it's really up to the individual, but certainly when it comes to evaluating, and as Jean-Guy had said and Kyle had said, you are able to buy pensionable service back. That's something that is taking place, and there's educationals when it comes to the MBLL strike and members there. But it really depends on the individual. I mean, obviously, we want all our members participating if there is job action, and we have to consider the fact that if there is significant gains in regards to our efforts in taking job action, and where we do see increases to the general wage increases, that's money that's going to come back to those members when it comes to severance pay. That is vital, and those dollars, are every dollar is important. So certainly, we think it's in the interest of the members to continue to stick around and participate in the job action and work with us through this.
Thanks, Colin. I have another one for you. I'm currently being accommodated in my job. What happens if we go on strike?
Well, we are certainly wanting to make sure that everyone with every ability has the, opportunity to contribute to job action. And so very much with MBLL and with MPI, we've provided opportunities for those members to do unique or different work in our offices, either in a phone bank, helping us put picket signs together. But we want to work with members and give everybody the opportunity as we can and within reason to be able to participate in taking job action.
Next question is, what happens if I work from home during the strike? If you're not working contrary to the strike and your work is not struck, you just do your job as you normally would. If your job is one of the jobs, say was in a targeted action, then you'd come to picket at probably the nearest location to wherever the picket lines are set up. We don't know where that is yet. That's something your bargaining committee will discuss if it comes to that. But that's basically it. If you're working from home, it doesn't really change anything. If your job is struck, then you wouldn't work. You'd come to the picket line. Otherwise, you do your job as normal. What's the next one? I work in a highway yard. Where am I going to picket? Another question. Whatever central location or wherever locations your committee chooses to pick, it could be the highway yard where you work. It could be the office in town. Maybe if there's a government office in town, it's really hard to say where that's going to happen. We're going to actively work on that going forward in the future. But right now, those questions have not been answered yet. So there are people working in our whole office. Will we be picketing outside our office? Yeah, that's another same question. It's probably yes, but it's hard to say. We'll try and make it as close location for our members. And if you travel, like I know with MPI, we've seen lots of people travel. They live outside the city and yet they work in Winnipeg. So if there's a picket line closer to your home, we'd encourage you to go to that location. So say if you lived in Selkirk and there's a line there, but you work in Winnipeg, we would encourage you, it's up to you, but if you want to, you could picket in Selkirk rather than waste all that fuel and gas and money and time coming to Winnipeg to picket. So we try to be as accommodating as we can. So how do I know if my job will be considered essential? What if only part of my job is deemed essential? What do I do if my employer asks me to do something that's non-essential? Susan, would you like to take that one, please?
Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, every employee who is identified as having essential functions as part of their job will get a letter telling them that and telling them what functions they need to do in the event of strike action. And you cannot be, it would be against the agreement for you to be asked to do any non-essential duties. And so if that arose, you would get on the phone to MGU, and MGU would deal with that with the employer. And if there was a dispute about that, we could go to a very quick arbitration process to resolve any issue.
Thank you, Susan. How much do I pay in dues if I have to work because I am deemed essential? Junkie?
So the MG Constitution requires that anybody who continues to work under essential services agreement while strike action is taking place will pay an extra dues rate over and above the normal 1.25% rate. That rate used to be 30%. It was quite hefty. Luckily, earlier this year, MGU changed those rules to give the board of directors the flexibility to set a much lower rate. That rate is determined by your elected board of directors. They usually make that determination if there's an essential services agreement after the agreement is concluded. That way they know what portion of you will be deemed essential and not, and then it allows us to do the math and make a recommendation on what that rate would be. What I can say is that the reason the rule was changed is that members and the board felt that 30% was much too high, and they wanted the ability to set it at a much lower rate. And I've certainly, with discussions I've had with your board of directors, although they will make the decision, I would be very surprised if it was anything close to 30%. I think the intent is to keep it much lower. But then the reason for the extra dues rate is that so that everybody in the bargaining unit shares more equitably in the burden of the strike. It's partly also to make a contribution to the defense fund, which is used to fund strike pay. And it's partly so that everybody has a bit of skin in the game. Everybody needs to have an incentive to ultimately get to a resolution. And if some members aren't losing anything as a result of the strike, they might not have the same incentive ultimately to ratify an agreement. So it's meant to be a fairness thing, to share more equitably in the strike and to create a shared incentive to ultimately get to a resolution, and partly to offset the cost of the people who are on strike and the strike pay that they would be earning.
Can I just weigh in here with one additional point? I understand, Jean-Guy, that in the event of a targeted strike, those who are in that area that are essential and continue to work during the targeted strike, they don't have to pay any extra dues rate. And I think that's a really important point that you haven't covered in your discussion. So I wanted to raise it.
I'm really glad you said that, Susan. Thank you for interjecting. Yes, in a targeted strike situation, because the people who are participating in the targeted strike get enhanced strike pay and really are made pretty close to their normal earnings, nobody pays an extra dues rate, even under essential services. Yes, that's correct, Susan. Thank you very much. And considering the bargaining committee is very much contemplating a variety of options that fall short of a full strike, like targeted strike action, I think that's really important.
Thank you, guys. What happens if I decide to work while we are on strike? If you're working contrary to the strike, we will assess a 30% dues rate against your paycheck, against your working. When people work contrary to a strike, it prolongs the strike, and it hurts everybody that's on the picket line, because we're trying to find a resolution. If you're working doing struck work, that pressure doesn't build on the employer, and it doesn't help us resolve it as quickly. So that's why there's a 30% dues. It's in our constitution, and it's been there a long time. And our board felt really strongly that it was important to keep it there to ensure that when we do go on strike, our members join the strike and help us fight for better wages, because it's so important. So now I'll get to the next question. What about the special wage adjustment? How do we know if we will get one? Colin, you got that one?
Well, it's important to note that the employer has, tabled money towards the special wage adjustments, but what is not clear is that, which of those classifications would be essentially receiving a special wage adjustments, and essentially what amounts. Our members put forward proposals for special wage adjustments when we solicited proposals last year in the fall, and certainly those classifications were put forward at the table, but nothing in regards to finalizing the classifications has been agreed to. I mean, certainly there's classifications that have to meet criteria of recruitment and retention through that process, but what the employer has proposed, there is no indication which classification would receive a special wage adjustment or what amount would be applied.
Perfect. Thank you, Colin. I got another one for you. What if I'm on sick leave during the strike?
Well, anyone who is on sick leave essentially right now would continue to be on sick leave. Anyone who is on long-term disability will continue to be on long-term disability. And essentially, if a member is on an unpaid leave of absence, they continue to be on a leave of absence. I mean, if it's somebody who is sick while we're taking job action, I mean, they take a sick day, but if they are not able to make a day on the picket line, then we would prorate their picket pay for that week. So, we want to ensure that members are able to take care of themselves, but we do not believe anyone who's currently on sick leave, if the strike takes place, would that impact their sick leave?
Thanks, Colin. Here's one for Jean-Guy. Can I buy back my pension if we go on strike?
The answer is yes. Your pension plan, the Civil Service Superannuation Plan, does allow you to buy it back after the strike. You can get information directly from the CSSB about how that works. They also, I know when we've had a strike, like at the recent liquor strike, CSSB does education sessions for those members in order to make sure they have the information they need to buy back that pension time if they want to.
Thanks, Jean-Guy. Next question is, what about the signing bonus, or as I call it, the bribe? Go ahead, Colin, you can take this one.
Well, the signing bonus is essentially what it is. It's the 1,800 and the 900 for part-time. I mean, this money is not compounded on general wage increases or on general wages like a general wage increase would be. We made it very clear to this employer that we wanted essentially to catch up and keep up with the modest increases we've received and how far behind we've gone. We wanted to see the employer allocate this money into general wage increases for all members, where when we deal with a lump sum payment, I mean, it's not pensionable and certainly it's taxable. And so a significant chunk of that, will not be going to the members.
Thanks, Colin. What does classification modernization mean? Can they pay me less than what I get right now if my classification is part of that process? Colin, I think there's another one for you.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's important to note that, what's being tabled here is not something that this is what the employer wants. This is a settlement offer by the employer. And what they're presenting here is something that should be concerning to every civil servant. They are trying to do a whole modernization of the classification structure of the pay grade, which has implications for the pay scales, the wage scales. And they want to take all these classifications and put them in through this matrix and establish where they fit on this scale and how they should be compensated within that process. There are significant implications within our subcomponent agreement and with many different aspects of the collective agreement that we feel that should be negotiated between the parties. It was very clear from the onset of our discussions with the employer on this process that they were only discussing their priority classifications, that they identified, we'll set aside and look at a specific homogeneous classification grouping, and we'll consult you on priority lists or priority classifications. That is not acceptable and should not be acceptable to this membership. I mean, there is a lot at stake here, which certainly makes their 2.5%, offers for special wage adjustments very disingenuous, because if they go through this process of reevaluating jobs and placing them at different steps on a wage scale, where does that money they promised through the special wage adjustments have the benefit if they're going to potentially see wages go down as a result of this process? And so I think it should be very concerning to our members, and certainly, if they were willing to work with us as we proposed on dealing with a pilot project, and essentially what I've said is renovating a room rather than demolishing the entire house. And we would be happy to work through and see how this has potential impacts within our collective agreement. But the employer could not give us any guarantees establishing that any of our members would be adversely impacted through this process. And so those are key issues that we need to look at when it comes to this process that the employer is looking at on classification modernization.
Thanks, Colin. Here, the next one's for Susan. We're supposed to have 5 people regularly, and if we go down to essential services, How are they going to allow us to participate in job action? Are we all essential?
Well, it's pretty hard to answer that without knowing precisely what you're doing. And I guess I go back to that definition of essential services. So are you doing work that is necessary to prevent danger? The safety, the health of the population. Is it about serious environmental damage? Is it about the maintenance of the rule of law? And so, there might be 5 of you doing a job that meets that definition, or some of it might meet that definition. And then the question is, will MGU's negotiation have resulted in agreement that all 5 of you are needed in the event of strike action in your work area? And that may or may not be the case, depending on the type of job. So you'll know once this agreement is reached, you'll get a letter from the employer. And if there are fewer than the 5 of you required, then there will be a schedule created for your area that will rotate through employees in the event that not all of you are required to work during a work stoppage. So hopefully that gives you some general information.
Thanks, Susan. Our next question is, how do I know if I'm part of a classification that will get a wage adjustment? Where of that 2.5% of payroll going that they committed? Where is that 2.5% of payroll going that they committed? I think it's one for Colin.
Thanks, Kyle. But I think, there has not been any agreed to amount or what classifications have been identified to receive any of the money allocated through the special wage adjustments. The employer tabled specific language on process that both parties would have to go through in evaluating each of those classifications based on strict criteria of recruitment and retention issues, as well as inversion or compression issues that we would have to review. So when they're saying, or members are asking, essentially, where's this 2.5? It is going to a limited amount of classifications that does not apply to which we want is to have, that money allocated to all classifications within the civil service. We certainly have challenges with recruitment and retention and in certain classifications, and addressing those through the special market adjustments has been a regular process we've gone through within the collective bargaining with the GEMA. But I think it's important to note that we want the biggest amount of this mandate to be allocated to all civil servants.
Thanks, Colin. I want to know if I'm essential before I vote. I think this one's for Susan.
I guess from my vantage point, I wonder why it matters, to be frank. And I guess I look at it this way: what you're being asked to vote on is the offer that's on the table from this employer acceptable? Should this be the next collective agreement? And if you think yes, you vote yes, I'll ratify it. If you think no, and in my mind the answer is resoundingly no, then you vote in favor of providing the bargaining committee with a strike mandate. Now, as I've outlined, some of you will work during a strike to the extent that it occurs in your area in order to continue to provide essential services. But everybody is in this together. So if there's strike action, it's going to affect everyone in one way or another. So I think the key decision and sort of thinking about down the road, am I going to be essential or not? And we won't have the answer to that, unfortunately, before the vote, but it would be dangerous to make assumptions. Oh, I'll be working or I won't be working. The strike may not even take place in your work area. You may be quite unaffected by it. It might be targeted in other areas of the workforce. But so really those questions and those considerations are for down the road. The decision to make when you cast your ballot is this offer acceptable? And as I've said, your bargaining committee has recommended rejection, and they've done so for all the reasons that Colin has outlined. And I would hate for someone to make the decision on whether to vote in favor or against the offer based on whether they would work during the strike or not. It's kind of a secondary point in my mind.
Thanks, Susan. I have another one for you from Transportation Infrastructure question. If on strike and there's a snowstorm, Can they mandate us back to work to plow the roads? If so, I heard that you have to pay 31% of your pay to the MGU for going to work during the strike. Can you please shed some light on this for us? Thank you.
Absolutely. So operations and transportation is one of the areas where we are discussing a number of people being on call in the event of a snowstorm. And also looking at having higher numbers required in the winter for the other duties that go on in that department, road patrols, etc. All of that is in the process of being discussed. And so, yeah, I guess in the event of an extraordinary event that isn't contemplated, yes, the essential services agreement would provide the opportunity or the ability for the employer to be able to call more people into work to maintain safety. And it's because it falls within that first part of the essential services definition. And I'm trying to think what the second part of your question was. I think it was about the dues, right? And so Jean-Guy had talked about well, where there is an across the board, so across the whole civil service, a walkout of everyone who can, then the essential workers would pay this extra dues that he's been talking about. And he's explained it's not going to be 30% because the board has, or the special convention specifically allowed that number to be reduced. And from what Jean-Guy said tonight, the expectation is it'll be very substantially lower than the 30%. But I want to emphasize again, that only applies in the event of an all-out walkout. So if it's a targeted strike where it's in only one area, if it happened to be in highways, which frankly I think is unlikely, but if it were in highways and you were essential and continued to work, you would not pay any extra dues as a result of being an essential worker because it's a targeted strike situation. And so hopefully that answers your question and gives you some comfort. It'll apply in the most limited of circumstances.
Thank you, Susan. Just want to give everybody a heads up. We have about 15 minutes left for tonight, so we're going to get to as many questions as we can, but thank you all for coming. And the next question is, I'm going on maternity leave in November. Now what? Colin, would you mind us taking those?
Well, certainly it will depend on the type of strike that takes place. If the area, is in different areas where the work is being struck, but if it does impact potentially an area where an individual is potentially going off on a maternity leave, then, certainly we would want to talk to the employer in advance and have those conversations. As I said, in some instances, we're able to establish strike protocols and address these key specific issues. But I mean, if somebody is on maternity leave, they would not be impacted by that. Now, we did say that during any potential job action, right, there would be no collective agreement in place for those essentially taking job action. So if somebody goes off on maternity leave during that period of time, there could be a temporary disruption with some of the benefits from the collective agreement. But I can assure those that in instances where a job action ends, we have always established a return to work agreement with the employer and established and tried to make whole any individual essentially who had gone off on maternity leave. I think it's in the employer's interest to make sure that anyone in that situation is made whole.
Thank you, Colin. Next question. Hello. With the vote just days away, I'm wondering why some coworkers received contract voting codes on the 15th and many of us haven't received anything. Our contact info is up to date. Are codes still being emailed or we have been missed? Those codes may have been for a local meeting because we have virtual local meetings as well. And potentially was speaking with Colin here just a second ago, is that we may have mailed out those codes earlier if they went out in the snail mail, the old fashioned way. So, but I can say that I wouldn't be concerned until sometime Friday, what's September 22nd at 2 is when the vote opens. If you haven't got any credentials by then, I would encourage you to reach out to the Resource Center so we can get your credentials. I'm not 100% sure what's going on there, so it's hard to answer that question. So
I mean, I can add that voting credentials for this
did
vote.
we ask for a higher boot allowance? Or Jean-Guy, do you have an answer for that before we go?
Sure. I would just say voting credentials
You're
for
muted,
this
Jean-Guy.
vote. Sorry. Okay. I was to say voting credentials for this vote were not sent out on the 15th. So that must have been for a different vote, probably a local meeting. Voting codes are going out this week by email and by mail for those people who get it that way.
Thank you, Jungi. And the next question was, did we ask for a higher boot allowance? Colin?
We certainly asked for many increases as it relates to our component levels and some of the provisions within our components. I mean, there's many people in trades, I mean, where we fall well short within our tool allowance, our qualification pay, I mean, boot allowance, meal allowances, and certainly many of these things were still at the table. And as we've said, in some cases, the employer had, where we felt we were making progress, they had actually pulled back part of their offer to bully us into withdrawing many of our proposals.
Here's the next one. If we are on strike for a month, how long does it take us to make back the wages that we lost while on strike? We all have financial commitments, but some people are close to the budget. It's hard to say. I can tell you with liquor, but they were in a bit different situation because they were almost 2 years out, not a year out like you guys, or 6 months. That with their back pay, a lot of them were made whole almost they'll be made whole by October 1st in that gain. But they gained almost 3-4%. And a lot of you guys are looking for the same. They've offered you the 4.2s, and not everyone else is going to see a lot. We don't know what other people are going to see in that. So a lot of people right now are facing 8%. And if we push that up to 12%, it's likely you'll recover that with that 4%, you'll recover it fairly quickly. It'd be less than probably a couple years, 3, 4, 5 years. It's hard to say depending on your circumstance, but the return is rather quick. I think it's because they came in so low at their first offer. So there's an opportunity there to gain that back. And remember also, if we go on strike, the next time we go to the bargaining table, we're also in a stronger position because they'll believe we're ready to go on strike. And that's a piece you have to remember, that it also helps the next round and maybe the next round after that. Those are important things to consider when you're fighting back against your employer, that it improves your position going forward because they'll actually believe this. I don't believe the government leading into this year believed we'd go on strike, and I think we got their attention now. So
And Kyle,
move on to the next question.
Kyle, can I add something there? If we are engaged in targeted strike action, then members aren't losing money really, because the people who are participating in the targeted strike action are pretty close to made whole by the enhanced strike pay. So you don't necessarily lose money in the event of strike action. It depends on the form of strike action.
Thanks, Shungi. Yep, that's fair. Why can't we consider conciliation or any sort of alternate dispute resolution? Colin?
Well, I think, the bargaining committee is open to any avenue that would keep us talking and moving forward at the bargaining table. I mean, I'll tell you, we've just been on a tour across the province. I mean, dealing with, and meeting with members and hearing their concerns. I mean, our members are mad. I mean, it's clear, and they should be mad. With the offer that the employer is presenting us, I think, all civil servants need to stand up and throw their support behind their bargaining committee, because the changes we need to make in this round clearly need to be made at the bargaining table. But your committee is steadfast and committed to, being at that table and trying to reach a fair settlement.
Thanks, Colin. Here's one for Susan. Can either party still access arbitration via the labor board after 60 days?
Yes. So in Manitoba, we have a process called subsequent contract arbitration that is available to parties where there has been a work stoppage that lasts 60 days. So on day 61, the union can apply. The board then makes a number of inquiries into sort of what's gone on and decides within 21 further days whether they will decide the terms of the contract. So it requires a work stoppage to continue for about 80 days, 82 days maybe, before the board will intervene, terminate the strike, and then conduct a hearing to determine the terms of the collective agreement. So that process is available at the end of the day if the strike goes on that long. However, as Colin said, the preference here in the particular circumstances is to make a deal at the table. And so the goal is to use the strike mandate and then, if necessary, strike action to gain the leverage to get the employer to make a fair deal at the bargaining table and not have to access arbitration. But it is there if it comes to that. And the position at arbitration would be improved by the fact that there has been this lengthy strike action. It shows the resolve of the members in rejecting the 2% that are on the table.
Thank you, Susan. I have another one for you. What would a strike look like for people that work in the court system?
So I mentioned earlier the third aspect of the definition of essential services. So work that is necessary to prevent disruption to the maintenance of the rule of law. And so those who work in the court system likely fall within that definition to some degree. And so it may well be like court clerks, for example, those types of positions have a high likelihood of being having essential duties. Whether there are more than would be required during strike action is another matter. Certainly, for example, if there's 20 people in a job, people take vacation, they are sick, certainly not all of them can be required at once. So, those kind of discussions are occurring in deciding the numbers, but those working in the courts are certainly an area where you can expect to get a letter setting out what your essential duties are in all likelihood.
Thank you, Susan. I actually have one more for you too. If I'm understanding correctly, it's the employer that determines who is deemed essential.
No, that is something that is negotiated between the parties in terms of the positions that are deemed essential. And then we will be are in the process of negotiating a mechanism whereby we would decide who actually has to work. So this scheduling system in the event that there's strike action in your area at a particular time. So it's a matter that is being vigorously negotiated between the parties, and we've been working on it very, very hard for quite a while. And as I said, there's real momentum in the discussions at this time.
Thanks, Susan. Here's one for Jean-Guy. There are a lot of employees that don't have an email. How do they get paid or vote?
Sure, I'll address that first for strike pay and then for voting. With respect to strike pay, the easiest, most efficient way to get strike pay is if we have your email address, we'll put you in touch with PayWorks. You provide your banking information to them through their secure method, and then you get your strike pay in a really quick way. It's worked super well. People who finished picket duty on a Friday have been getting paid on a Wednesday every week. However, if you don't have an email address and don't want to do that, we do have a manual system for sending out checks. It's just that it takes longer. We have to mail it out to your mailing address. But even then, you got to make sure that we have your up-to-date and correct mailing address. With respect to voting, if we have your up-to-date personal email address, you will receive your voting credential by email. If not, we will be mailing you a voting credential through the regular Canada Post mail. But again, in order for that to work, you need to make sure that we have your up-to-date mailing address.
Thanks, Jean-Guy. Next question is, with over 11,000 members, do you have to have 5,751 in favor of strike or 51% of those who vote? It's 50% plus one of those who vote. If they vote in favor of strike, that's what give us a strike mandate. We're hoping for a much stronger mandate from you guys. I think it's important that we have a strong mandate, so we understand you guys are serious. It makes our lives a lot easier too when we go going forward. So just remember that. Here's the next question. Have you been working to secure flexible work arrangements for members? Colin?
Well, certainly we have, put proposals forward, and heard from our members in regards to, work from home arrangements or different type of work arrangements that would provide greater opportunity to recruit and retain employees. And those were front and center, certainly in our discussions. In recognition of, what the federal public sector union had done in regards to have some language within their collective agreement. We already have language within our collective agreement and that talks about the ability to apply for work from home arrangements. Certainly, we had raised concerns and proposals at the table because, I mean, like we've seen in the federal government, at a moment's instance, this government can change their policy. And so, we wanted stronger language in regards to that. And we felt that, those are certainly priorities for our members. I mean, having the ability to work from home creates greater flexibility and a greater, opportunity to recruit and retain employees. And, with the costs that we've seen, in traveling to downtown or commuting to work, I mean, those things become far more important. So, they're certainly in consideration.
Thanks, Colin. Next one is, how is the type of strike being determined? Well, the type of strike, whether it be rolling, targeted, or full on, or even something smaller or greater than that, it's determined by your bargaining committee. And also, you have a say in this. Their bargaining committee, I'm sure, will reach out to many of you members to understand where you work and what you do, to try and make sure it's impactful without hurting you as best possible. So if it's a targeted action, we want to apply the most pressure we can against the government while hurting our members the least, or having least of them suffering during the strike. So our goal is to apply maximum pressure, and our bargaining committee will, I'm sure, will reach out to some of you and have those questions. Or if you have ideas, I would encourage you to reach out to your bargaining committee and say, hey, you know what, if we do this, this could be really impactful, because those things, you guys are the experts at what you do, and your bargaining committee, they know a lot about what goes on, but they don't know everything. So it's really helpful if you guys have some ideas to bring those forward to your bargaining committee, because it can be really impactful in the future. So if the majority don't vote to support a strike mandate, does this mean we are accepting the current offer? Yes, unfortunately, yes. If people vote in favor of accepting the offer, because the question is, I accept the offer, or no, I vote to strike, that means the offer would be accepted, which, I don't know, my opinion, wouldn't be a good thing. Your bargaining committee is not recommending this offer because they think there's a lot more out there to get, and we can get a better offer to you guys. So I really implore you to support your bargaining committee. Your bargaining committee has done a lot of work, and they really want to put in that time to make sure you guys do much better at the bargaining table than you have in the past. And this is our opportunity. So here's the last question of the night. I am the timekeeper for our unit. Will I be responsible to report who does their strike hours or not, or who might be working? How will this be monitored? Well, during a strike, we'll have strike captains, and your strike captains are the ones who track the time for picketing. And if there's essential services and there's some type of essential service where there's a group of you that are all deemed essential, we would build a schedule to try and make it even, and the MGU would manage that. It wouldn't be upon you as a member to do it. It might be you, but I'm saying it might be us, it might be someone else. But yes, we will work collaboratively with the members to do all these things to make sure it's done fairly and correctly and ensure everyone's treated equally. So I just want to say thank you guys all for joining us tonight. And I really appreciate our panelists helping out for all their answers and questions tonight. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jean-Guy. Thank you, Colin, or as I call him, Goose. I get to be Maverick. I'm the president. If you have any further questions, I think please reach out to the Resource Center. You can send an email to rc@mgeu.ca or give them a call, and we'll do our best to get you an answer as soon as we can. So thank you all for coming tonight. Have a good evening, and thanks for taking the time, and see you soon.